Hi everyone, welcome to THT, and today we are going to talk about the best mechanic from Magic the Gathering that could be implemented for Star Wars Unlimited. So this is going to be an interesting video. We're going to be highlighting 13 mechanics from Magic that I think would be a great fit for Star Wars and how it could make Star Wars a better game for future expansions. So this video is sponsored by Card Market, the best marketplace to buy and sell cards in Europe, and it works for Star Wars Unlimited but also works for Magic as well. So for this video I'm going to assume that you know at least the basic rules of Magic the Gathering, at least you're vaguely familiar with the very basic of Magic. It's not such a different game from Star Wars Unlimited. In fact, it's probably Star Wars Unlimited main inspiration, even though Star Wars Limited draws inspiration from many other games. But basically the first question we're probably asking ourselves is, why should we steal mechanic from Magic? Why is there value in using some mechanic that are in Magic? Those are two different games. Why would we want to do this? Well, first of all, those are not that different of a game. MTG and Star Wars Limited are similar enough that most mechanic from Magic would actually translate really well in Star Wars Unlimited, and in fact that's already the case. We're already doing it. There's already many mechanics from Magic that are in Star Wars, and way before Star Wars came out, way before many mechanics were already in the game. Moving on, Magic has more than 30 years of experience using those mechanics. One of the reasons why I think FFG designers were usually always made games that were quite different from the standard card games. I've decided with Star Wars Unlimited to actually go with the classic formula and to make a game that is maybe a little bit more similar to the classic Magic, is because Magic has more than 30 years of experience. And whenever you're a designer, it's extremely useful to have a benchmark, to have like things you can say, okay, instead of trying to make everything from scratch and making a brand new concept that might not work, take something that actually works and improve upon it. And the same logic applies for the base rule of the game, and it also applies for the specific mechanics in the game as well. Throughout the years, Magic has tried pretty much everything that was possible to try for a trading card game. And now from that experience, we know what works and what doesn't. And also we know what can be adjusted in order for this to work. Obviously, a lot of mechanics, what works for Magic might not work for Star Wars. And it's the reason in the video we're going to be talking about the mechanics, which I think would be a great fit for Star Wars specifically. And finally, the design space of card games like these is not infinite. And if Star Wars Unlimited continues to grow, which we hope it's going to be for the foreseeable future, it's only a matter of time until it's going to have to borrow from the outside. And it doesn't have to come from Magic, but it can also come from other card game. But Magic is probably the one that has the biggest amount of mechanics to draw from, a biggest pool of different unique mechanics that would translate really well. And most other card games also have mechanics that also they borrow from Magic as well. So this list is in no particular order. I've selected 13 mechanics, but there's no specific order in which I post those different mechanics. And the first mechanic I'm going to want to talk about is the level up keyword. So the level up keyword basically is the idea that you can spend mana in Magic in order to, which is the equivalent of resource in Star Wars Unlimited, in order to put level counters on your units, and depending on the amount of level counters that they have, they get new abilities and better stats. So for example, this unit starts at 0.3. Once it has one level counter, it becomes 0.6, and until it becomes, as its final form, a 6/6 Island Walk with the Island Walk ability. So that's basically the basic rule of this. And why do I think this would be a great fit for Star Wars? So first of all, it really gives you a feel of progression. I think one of the great things about Magic and Star Wars Unlimited is that as you get more resources throughout the game, you have this power fantasy of getting stronger and stronger and being able to put bigger and bigger threats. Well, this is just another avenue to actually integrate a feel of progression in the game, feeling that your unit was level up as the game progresses. You are basically pumping them and making them stronger and stronger. The entire genre is based on this. That's obviously the RPG genre. And the idea of having this little RPG mechanic in the game, I think, is really, really cool. So it gives us this feel of progression, this power fantasy. It also creates very memorable moment because, of course, getting into the final level is something that you're not going to be able to do very often. And whenever those kind of rare things happen, rare exciting things happen, it kind of creates stories and memorable moments that you can tell in your game, and that's very important in the game. Like you can say, oh, last night I managed to get my units to max level, and it completely won me the game. X Drinker, for example, is a good example of this. Get up to 8 level plus, it becomes a 6/6 that has protection against everything. That is like a memorable experience. You're not going to be able to do this every game, but when you can, it's going to create stories. Another cool thing is like it gives you something to do with your spare resource. So something that happens, and obviously those games are very kind of focused on trying for you to play on curve, where you're trying to utilize all the resources you have at your disposal every single turn. Leader's ability can help with this in Star Wars, but often enough, you're going to be having some time to have to play under curve because you don't have the right card at the right moment. So it kind of gives a little bit more stuff to do with your resources and other way to spend your resource, and making sure so you have a compensation for having maybe a suboptimal turn, which I think is a very positive for the game. It's a very slow and fair mechanic that is easy to interact with. Of course, those are based on creatures in Magic, which are the equivalents are units in Star Wars Limited that obviously can be attacked at any moment, can be dealt with. It would actually be even more interactable in Star Wars Limited because of the back and forth nature of the game, and also because unit can be attacked. So I'm anticipating this mechanic would have to be a lot stronger in Star Wars Limited than it is in Magic, because in Magic, in Star Wars Limited, creatures units are much easier to interact with. It's a very thematically strong ability. Thematically strong. It's a very simple as well, so it makes a lot of sense, and it's also really quite easy to understand, which is always a positive. You want to avoid making your game more complicated whenever possible. Another cool thing as well is that it allows early game creatures to be relevant even at all stages of the game. So for example, X Drinker, once a good example, it's a decent card to play on turn 1, but as the game progresses, it becomes to be a really bad card. But then of course later on in the game, you can play it, and then you can level up it right away, spending all of your resource, all of your mana, and therefore making it a significant threat. It means that what would have been a really bad top deck becomes a really powerful top deck even late in the game. And I think having cards like this that can once again make the game a little bit less random, where you don't feel as bad for drawing your 2-drops late in the game when you play Star Wars, I think that's also very positive. So how would that work in Star Wars Unlimited? So basically, I think each level up would have to count as an action. So it would be a very action intensive system. Or maybe it doesn't have to be that way. Maybe we can make it such it actually count as a free action, where you can take that action a little bit like in Kazuda, where you can spend to level up your character and take an action at the same time. Otherwise, it would be very action intensive, which can have some benefit in a sense that it makes it so it's much more interactable. And also you can actually use it as a way to kind of stall action. There's some situation where you don't want to play as many actions as possible, but you just want to play an action to see what your opponent does. So maybe that could be used like this. And obviously in Star Wars Limited, leveling up your unit won't always be the right choice because sometimes you just want to have initiative. And obviously in Star Wars Limited, it would be even more interactable than in SWU. So should he need action cheating or should he not need action cheating? This remains to be cleared out, and probably this is a question that would probably require testing to see what is the right way to go about it. My next mechanic that I have to choose is the Saga. So Sagas is not really a keyword, it's more of a new type, it's a subtype of card in Magic, it's a subtype for enchantment. And the way that works is that you will play a Saga, which is basically a little story. And at the beginning of every turn, you're gonna add a token on this Saga, and depending on if it's the first, the second, the third, or the fourth token, something is gonna happen. And once you have more than 4 tokens, then you basically sacrifice the card, and it has basically the story is over and nothing else happens. So, and obviously that's not always the case, but the benefit becomes bigger and bigger as the story advances. So for example, this one on the first turn, you have it, you're gonna get a 1/1 unit. The second one, you're going to be able to put some +1/+1 counters, which is the equivalent in Star Wars Limited would be experience token on 3 units. This one allows you to actually defeat a unit, and it tells the story of the Force Iron game, which is the equivalent in Magic of the Olympic Games. So it's kind of a really cool, it's a great way to tell a story. So what is the benefit of this mechanic? First of all, I think that once again, it gives you a feel of progression. As you're adding more tokens to the saga, it becomes stronger and stronger, which I think is a really, really cool concept. Once again, it's the idea of feel of progression, but this time you are progressing not by spending resource like the level up world would, but just over time by just spending some turn. It creates memorable moments again, because as you are reaching the end of the adventure, something pretty extraordinary is going to happen, and you're not always going to get there. There's certain sagas where getting to the end of it is very, very unlikely. So it creates memorable moment when, in a rare occasion where that actually does happen. It's a very slow and fair mechanic because it's a very slow mechanic. Enchantments are not easy to interact with, but because it happens just turn after turn, there's time for the opponent to kind of react to it. It once again changed the play pattern because your opponent knows what's going to happen, so it can kind of play around it. So I think it's really, really cool. But really one of my favorite thing about the sagas in Magic is like they're very thematic. They are basically little cards that tell stories as they progress, and I think they're really, really cool from a thematic standpoint. I think for me this is the strongest point for Star Wars Unlimited. They're easy to understand, and they're easy to understand. So if you talk about sagas in Star Wars Unlimited, I think the main reason why we want sagas in Star Wars Unlimited is just because it's the perfect game for it. It's basically, Star Wars is full of those stories, full of those character arcs, and you could make so many different sagas over the different characters. Of course, the most memorable one is the saga of the Skywalker, but you could make sagas about anything. You can make sagas on every character that has a strong character arc could have a saga, which I think would be really, really cool. Imagine the saga of Anakin, where you play the card and then at some point it just flips to the dark side and do something crazy. I think that's really cool. Like, you could just do so many cool things with this system. The next mechanic we talk about is the Morph mechanic, which is a much older mechanic where basically the way that works is that you can spend 3 mana to play a card face down, the card that has Morph, and the card basically count as being a 2/2 creature. And then you can spend the Morph cost, so when a card is face down, your opponent doesn't know what it is. It's completely hidden, and because all Morph cost the same and have the same stats, there's no way to know that what kind of Morph it is. You know it's a Morph card, but you don't know what it is. And then you can flip it upside down by paying its Morph cost, which this cost is different from creatures to creatures, and then the creature flips up. Sometimes they have an effect, sometimes they don't. And this is basically the main purpose of this mechanic, is to once again create it's kind of an effect of surprise, and also it allows sometimes Morph cost is usually cheaper than paying the card at full. I mean, the overall cost is more expensive, the cost of putting the card down plus the card and morphing in, but because you're paying it in 2 phases, you're basically splitting the cost. Instead of having to split all the cost of the creature at once, you can pay the first part of the cost and then the second part when you actually face it down. It depends, of course, on the Morph cost. Some cards have very high Morph cost, sometimes a very low Morph cost, and some cards actually do something, have an effect when they get turned face up, and some don't. But it's a really, really cool mechanic with a lot of design space here. So what is the advantage of this mechanic in Magic? So first of all, it's a cool element of surprise that creates a unique gameplay pattern. It's a huge amount of design space to create new effects and really cool things where you don't know what's going to happen. When you have this extra element of incomplete information, it's not longer now the card that you have in hand, you don't know what's going to happen. It's also the cards on the battlefield, you don't actually know what they are, which I think is a really, really cool system. Another cool thing, one of the things to say about Morph in Magic is that Morph is kind of an outdated mechanic, because back when Morph was first introduced to Magic, creatures were a lot weaker than what they are now. And basically nowadays, a 2/2 for 3 is pretty horrible. Even back then, it was not a good stat line, but which is on purpose, because the main advantage is when the card flips over. But obviously, the Morph creature is supposed to be underpowered, but obviously it was just way too underpowered, and it was ended up being kind of not, this mechanic unfortunately did not really translate really well into modern Magic. But that's a very fixable thing whenever we are going for it for Star Wars Limited, we can just make the default morph creatures a lot stronger. It's a very slow and fair mechanics which encourage interactions. It's also thematically strong. There's lots of ways to make this mechanic very thematically powerful, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So how would that work in Star Wars Limited? I think I would definitely rename the mechanic Stealth. I think that makes more sense. And I think the Stealth unit should probably be something like a 2/3 hidden for 2. Would be a good sight line. So 2/3 for 2, so you can't just get killed right away as it comes into play. It's more resilient, and you will have more opportunity to actually, and it would actually cost 2, which is obviously 2/3 for 2 hidden is not good. But once again, it's just a basic morph unit, and the idea is just to keep it alive, and because it has hidden, it's more likely to be alive. Another way to do it would be to make it a 1/4, to make it a bit tankier, no hidden. Like, there's different ways of doing it, but basically making the 2 drops relatively difficult to kill I think would be a good idea. Moving on to my next mechanic is Suspend. So Suspend is the idea that instead of paying the normal cost of a card to cast it, you can pay a discount cost, but instead of playing the card right away, it will take 4 turns for the card to actually come into play. So basically you put, it's a card of Suspend 4, you put 4 time counters on it, every turn you remove a time counter, and when it has no time counter, you actually play the card for free. So it's actually a pretty cool mechanic. Where you're basically trading resource for delaying the card by getting a discount, which I think is really, really cool and unique. So what is the advantage of this mechanic in Magic? So in my opinion, it provides interesting options and meaningful decisions, because you always have to think about, do I pay the full cost for the card even though it might be a little bit overpriced, or do I pay the discounted price but then I'm gonna have to wait 5 turns for this to come into play? I think it's a really interesting kind of decision point, and once again it changes play patterns quite significantly. I think Suspend has been misused a lot in Magic, because the most powerful Suspend cards were the one that basically did not have a normal cost, could only be played for the Suspend cost, and happen to be card that give you a huge advantage whenever you play them early. And I think this was kind of like a bummer, because this is not really what the mechanic I think was supposed to be. And unfortunately in competitive play, that's mostly how it's been used. And that's the reason why I think a lot of people think negatively about this mechanic, even though the mechanic is really cool. It's just that they printed those kind of cards. In my opinion, for this mechanic to actually work, you need to have basically both sides of the ability being interesting. You can play the card for its novel cost, or you can play for Suspend cost. It's a slow and fair mechanic. In my opinion, to implement this mechanic into Star Wars Limited, the card would have to be I think the mistake that you can make with Suspend is to make the card too powerful when played early. I think there were a card called Ancestral Vision that basically drew you 4 cards whenever it was played, and the card was insanely powerful when played early, but then completely useless when played later in the game, because it has Suspend 4, and once again, he had no way to be played for the regular cost. So for me, the way is that you don't want this card to give too big of an advantage whenever it's played early, but in order to make up for this, you need to make the card quite playable if you play just for a normal cost. And I think if you do it that way, it's a really, really cool mechanic. The next mechanic is called Ward. And basically Ward works that if a creature becomes the target of a spell or an ability, your opponent has to pay an extra cost. It's not always 2. This one is a Ward 2, so you have to pay 2 extra mana to be able to target the unit, but sometimes it can be more than this. Sometimes it can be different costs, sometimes it can be discard a card, it can be a number of different things. And it's a really, really cool mechanic. So why is Ward a good mechanic in Magic? Well, first of all, it provides creatures with protection, but still with the possibility to interact. And one of the things that I really hate are protective ability that completely shut things down. Things like X-Proof or Shroud, things like the card cannot be targeted at all, makes the card very, very difficult to interact with, which create very unfun playing pattern. And there's a couple of cards like this in Star Wars Limited, which we'll talk about. Well, the advantage of the Ward mechanic is that it's a barrier, it makes it more difficult, and it gives some protection to the card, but it's not unsurmountable, and if you really want to deal with the card, you actually can. You just have to pay extra. And I think this is just a much better way to go about this. I think it's important to have some sort of protections ability for units because it will allow basically creatures that don't have an immediate impact on the game to be playable. I think if you don't have protection ability like this, protective abilities like shield also is another good example of a well-designed protective ability. You're gonna end up in that situation where basically any card that doesn't have immediate impact on the game becomes unplayable, because then but giving them protective ability actually makes slower card more viable, which I think is really important for a game. It's a mechanic that became so simple and so good that it became an evergreen ability, which means that it's an ability that is not tied to a specific set, but basically was reused in Magic over and over and over again. So how would that work in Star Wars Unlimited? Because obviously the problem in Star Wars Unlimited is that so we had cards that are basically very difficult to interact with, like Chewbacca pilots or even Phantoms, and those cards in my opinion are completely obnoxious because they are very difficult to interact with. There are very few cards that can actually affect them, and you can very easily just put upgrades on them and just have them just completely take over the game. And this does not create fun play patterns, because once again there are things that can counter them. So if you can find the answers, it's a big blowout, and if they don't, then the game is just completely over, and this is just not a good thing. So I would rename the war mechanic countermeasure. And what I would do is, you can't really put the war mechanic into Star Wars Unlimited just immediately, copy paste the mechanic, because the concept of targeting does not exist in Star Wars. So you would have to create a different mechanics. And the way it would read would be, for example, countermeasure X being the cost that you have to pay, is this unit can't be captured, exhausted, damaged, returned to hand, or defeated by enemy card's ability unless that opponent pays or does X. So basically, it kind of is the combination of Chewbacca and TIE Phantom, so really bulletproof to anything, but you can pay a cost to bypass this. And then there's different parts. And so I think this would be a really cool mechanic that I think would work quite well. And once again, it's a much healthier way to integrate protective ability into the game, other than have those and also the cool thing is, like, yes, it's a pretty wordy ability, but because it's a keyword, you can just put the keyword and then you don't even need to put this reminder text anymore after a while. So I think that's also cool. Next I've decided to talk about devotion. So devotion is a mechanic that basically gives you a certain amount of value depending on your devotion, and your devotion basically is the amount of mana symbol on the cost of the card. So you got a card that has 2 mana symbols on it, that's devotion. So 2 mana, a blue symbol on it, for example, that's devotion for blue 2, for example. So obviously on Star Wars Limited, we would look at not the mana symbol, but the aspect icons, which some units in the game have multiple of, which is really cool. So what would it be cool about the devotion in Magic? Why is it a good mechanic? Well, it's a simple and fun mechanic that encourages monocolored deck, which is something that Magic has been suffering from for a very long time. In Magic, it's almost always the right play to play at least 2 colors, but often even like 3 colors, and even 3 colors with a splash for a 4th. Now even 4 colored mana is becoming so stable. People are playing 4 color decks, and there's very little incentive to actually play only 1 color in the game. And this is basically, this mechanic, devotion, was one of the best mechanic in the entire game to encourage players to play like mostly monocolored deck, which I think is very cool. So it also encouraged permanent based gameplay. So what I mean by permanent is basically units that stays on the field rather than just stuff in your hand. It's also so one caveat that I'm going to say about devotion is like why it was a cool mechanic. I think the mistake that they've done with Magic is that they basically dedicated an entire block to that mechanic, where all 3 sets of the block had the same devotion focus mechanic, and this created basically devotion deck became like way too powerful in standard during that time. So that thing was a mistake that you didn't have to do. I think that in my view, basing 1 set on this mechanic is more than enough to create some cool decks, and I think basing all 3 sets on it give just too much support and made it so in competitive play only monocolor deck were actually good, but that was only in standard though. And the disadvantage of this is that obviously multicolor deck, there's more diversity to be had in multicolor deck than in monocolor deck. So I think the ideal is to have both, not to only have one. So how would that work in Star Wars Unlimited? So basically right now, there's not enough reason to build double aspect deck. I think has been one of the major issue with Star Wars Unlimited right now, is that there's just simply not enough reason to build double aspect deck. So I think Devotion card would help a lot in enabling this, assuming they're good enough, obviously. The other thing that I really like about the Devotion in Star Wars Unlimited is like it would allow cards that don't see any play to actually be a lot more played. So one of the things is, like, for example, cheap cards that have double aspect on them. So cards like Exile from the Forest, Mr. Bones, Protector, those kind of cards that are very cheap to play, only pay one, and have 2 aspect icons on them would become a lot more powerful because they would actually boost your Devotion for that color a lot for a very cheap price, which I think is a really, really cool thing. So I think it would add a lot to the game to have this in Star Wars Unlimited. The next mechanic is Flashback. So Flashback is a pretty straightforward mechanic. It's basically when a card is in your discard pile, it's called a graveyard in Magic, you can spend a special flashback cost to actually replay that card. And when you do, you remove that card from the game, which means it's no longer usable. And this Flashback has been a standalone classic card in classic mechanic in Magic. And it's one of the most beloved mechanic in the game. It's been reused many times through Star Wars history. And it's a cool mechanic just because it provides more options, and providing more option is great. It's just really fun to have more options in the game because it gives you more agency. It makes the game more skill intensive, and that's a positive, as long as it's not making the game too complicated, which I don't think it does. It also encourages you to pay more attention to the graveyard, which is the discard pile in Star Wars. And the idea of, once again, making the discard pile matters more, I think is a good thing. Right now, we don't really have Flashback in Star Wars Unlimited. The closest thing we have to it is Bounty on the Crew, that when played, you can return the event back to your hand. But this is not really Flashback because you have to return the card back into your hand and then you have to pay the cost. So you're already paying attack. So it's not exactly Flashback, even though it kind of serves the same general purpose. One I think what I love about Flashback is like it's less fiddly than Smuggle. Smuggle, the thing that is a bit fiddly with Smuggle is that you always have to check your resource. It's a bit awkward during the game, what is underneath your resource to know what you can play. While I acknowledge the fact that Smuggle has some benefit, like for example, it gives you an element of surprise, and also Flashback is limited in the fact that it can only allow you to replay cards that have already been played. But it's a less fiddly mechanic than Smuggle. I think it's a different mechanic, and I think both mechanic would be nice to have. Right now, the discard pile in Star Wars Unlimited matters very little, and there's only a few cards that really interact well with the discard pile. I think the best example is probably Anakin, and I think the game would benefit from having more things that interacts with the discard in general. And yeah, so the next is Madness. So the Madness mechanic is pretty simple. Is whenever a card gets discarded, instead of discarding the card, you can actually play it for its Madness cost, and after you do this, the card just goes in the discard pile normally. So it basically gives you a discount when so it's card advantage because instead of discarding, you're actually playing the card, and also usually Madness costs less than the actual cost of the card. So Madness in Magic, basically it's a payoff for self-discard strategies. So whenever you have a card that allows you to discard yourself, it gives you a way to get value from that. It provides more options, obviously, as now you have to, once again, do you discard this card and play from your discard, or do you play it from with Madness, or do you decide to just play it normally? There's a lot of interesting decision making here, and it encourages to use unusual card. So there's cards that basically self-discard that normally would not be very good can become really powerful in the context of a Madness deck. In Magic, great example for this would be Black One, a card that currently doesn't see much play because there's not a lot of discard interaction. This card would benefit a lot from mechanic like Madness. It would also benefit a lot from mechanic like Flashback. unfortunately, there's just very little discard synergies in the game, which makes black one not worth it. But it's card that could be powerful in this context. Generally speaking, Star Wars, I mean, there's a lot of self-discard engine. There's a lot of card that requires you to discard your own cards in Star Wars Unlimited, but not many ways to take advantage of them. Next mechanic on the menu here is Transform. So Transform is basically a card. So this is basically the face up of the card, and the back of the card, instead of having the normal card back, has actually this instead. So, and the way that works is you play the card from its face up, and then there is a specific condition that basically allows you to turn it on the other side. So for example, in this case is at the end of the turn, if you gain 3 or more life, you get to transform it on the other side. And usually the transform side is more powerful than the normal side, but that's not always the case. But so transform is a mechanic that I absolutely love, and I think it's been one of the reasons why Innistrad was one of the most beloved sets in Magic. So it is probably one of the most thematically appealing mechanic in Magic. For example, they had an entire race based on around this mechanic with the werewolves, where basically all cards would be played as humans, but then if you no cards were being played during a turn, they would flip on the werewolf side on the turn after, and it could actually flip back to the human side if and whenever you play 2 cards on the same turn. So depending on the amount of cards you play, you would either be daytime or nighttime. Nighttime you got your wolves, daytime you got your humans. And obviously humans have more powerful abilities but weaker stats, while the werewolves are just basically more powerful. So it's a really, really cool mechanic, and there's just so many cool things that throughout the years Magic has done with the transform mechanics. So once again, it's a mechanic that encourages different play patterns, as obviously you are often encouraged to do things that you would normally not do in the game, just to be able to transform your units and make them stronger. Cards not having card back was a very daring thing to do by Wizard of the Coast, but it ended up being a minor inconvenience. So basically, if you ever want to play those cards and you're not running sleeves, basically all you gotta do is there's a little reference card that you're supposed to put in your deck and tick what the card is, and then you can basically put the real card in play whenever you actually play the card. But honestly, nobody did this. 99% of people would just simply put the actual card on the sleeve and just turn the card inside out whenever it gets transformed during a game. Some people would even have extra copies of the card, and they would just transform the card by slapping it on the battlefield. But honestly, I like the just flipping in the sleeve better. So it's a little bit fiddly, but honestly, it's a very small price to pay for such a great mechanic that has definitely changed Magic and made Magic such a better game, in my opinion. So obviously, it also opens up like a tremendous amount of design space. There's just so many cool things you can do with this. Which honestly, those 2 examples that I've shown here is only scratching the surface. So we kind of already have a transform mechanic in Star Wars Unlimited with the leaders themselves. The best example, obviously, Chancellor Palpatine that turns into light side, dark side. But honestly, every single leader in the game is kind of a transform card. But I think it would be a lot cooler to have this for units. There's a lot of unit that could basically be, let's say you could play Anakin, and the Anakin would basically turn into Vader if you actually do certain things. You could do this with many other characters in the saga, like Darth Maul into Maul, Ben Solo into Kylo Ren, Kalesh into General Grievous. Anything could work. Any character that has kind of a drastic transformation could benefit from this transform mechanic, and I think would be super, super cool to have. The next mechanic is a mechanic that doesn't really have a proper keyword, but it's something that is unique to Magic, and I've never seen this in any other game, and I think it's a shame. I think any game that has the sideboard mechanic built in their game should have cards that interact with the sideboard. And in this one, I'm talking about a card that search in the sideboard. So typically, card that in Magic it says that they actually get a card from outside the game, but in the errata it basically means a card that is in your sideboard. And some of this, I made some of the best card. One of my favorite card, Burning Wish. Here, this is Cunning Wish, which allows it to get you an instant card from outside the game. And those are tutors, so they basically allow you to search for a specific card. So basically the main advantage of those kind of sideboard tutor, we call them the wish effect in Magic, is that they are more convenient than regular tutors, because you don't have to clutter your deck with a bunch of situational cards that you might be want to tutor throughout the game. Instead, you put those cards in your sideboard instead, so they don't actually clutter your deck. So the idea is, of course, to put a bunch of different cards that you would want of each super situational card that you only will search using this wish effect. Another thing you can do is, like, let's say you want to have there's a card that's particularly important to your deck. Like, for example, you're playing Control and you want to have more copies of Super Laser Blast. Well, you play 2 Super Laser Blast in your main deck, and then you play 3 copies of whatever wish that can fetch for Super Laser Blast, and then you can play this card and you can actually search the last copy of Super Laser Blast that is in your sideboard. That kind of thing. So what is the benefit of this? So first of all, it allows super situational card to be playable. Like super situational card that normally would not see play can become playable when those kind of cards exist. It gives more options for players to adapt against certain strategies. I think it's very, very cool to give players more options to be able to adapt themselves to whatever they're facing, because it gives them more tools to actually balance the game. It also gives more options to interact. It makes combo deck more consistent, as people can put their combo piece in their sideboard in order to get more chances to find them using that tutor. And it also makes combo deck more interactive, because combo players will also find specific cards that will protect their combo in specific matchup from their sideboard using those kind of cards. And the cool thing is, like, it doesn't make combo decks less interactive and faster. It makes them more interactive but slower, because obviously you have to pay the tutor first and then play the card. So currently in Star Wars Limited, we have one tutor, which is the Search Your Feelings, which doesn't search from the sideboard but search in the deck, which is a pretty classic effect to have. Unfortunately, this card has been pretty overpriced. I think this card should have cost 3, not 4, which means that the card sees almost no play. It saw a little bit of play in set 1, but then relatively quickly disappeared. And even in set 1, it was only played because of it was quite powerful in a Mirror of Control, but that's pretty much the only reason. I think one of the reasons we want those kind of effects in the game is because as the game is expanding and more cards are being added to the game, we are risking to end up in a rock, paper, scissors meta. What do I mean by rock, paper, scissors meta? It's basically a meta where your matchup is the biggest determinant factor on who's going to win the game, not the skill of the player themselves. So for example, a typical situation is the reason, for example, why I don't like to play Palpatine in a tournament is because it puts control of the game out of my hands. It's like, I know that I'm going to have a very good matchup into most mid-range decks, but if I'm facing an aggro deck, I'm almost auto-winning. I'm almost auto-losing. So you want to avoid this as much as possible in games, and you want players to be able to adapt their game plan to their opponents. And Wish are a good way to do that. And those kind of sideboard tutor does give more opportunities to interact. And I think that you don't want to end up in a situation where, oh yeah, well, you want players to be able to adapt. You don't want players to end up in a situation where, oh, I'm just screwed because it's the bad matchup. Obviously, this is always going to be the case. There's always going to be better and worse matchup, and that's part of the fun of the game, to figure out what is the best deck for a given meta. But it doesn't change the fact that you don't want this to reach a certain extreme. And as the game is expanding and as there's more diversification of strategies, this is only going to get worse and worse over time, especially as we are expanding towards Eternal. And I think this is, once again, is the kind of card that, and this is the reason why Wish Effect, those can, I think, have been particularly powerful in Eternal format like Legacy, where they're legal, is because in Legacy there's such a great diversity of different decks you can encounter. Having card that gives you more answers are really positive. So Sideboard Tutor can basically help with that. Another cool thing about those cards is, like, super situational card I currently don't see any play would actually be playable if Sideboard Tutor actually existed. And it helps combo decks which currently don't see any play in Star Wars, so wouldn't hurt to make combo decks a bit more playable. Once again, I'm pretty big fan of combo deck as long as they're interactive, and those cards actually make combo decks more interactive. Okay, next mechanic is the split cards / fuse. So this is basically two mechanics that kind of work together. The first one is the fact that you got 2 cards in one, and you can, whenever you play that, you can decide which one of them you're playing. You can either play the card called back and get this effect, or the card called and get this effect. So it's basically 2 cards in one, and you can choose which effect you're doing. And the fuse is like, if you actually pay the cost of both cards, you can actually play them together. And usually fuse cards have a synergy with each other. If you get to cast both things, they actually combo off each other, which is really cool. So that's a mechanic that I really love. Split cards have been done in a great number of different ways in Magic. My favorite one is the split card. There was a regular split cards that didn't have fuse, and then they added the fuse. I think the split cards fuse is the best one of them, but there's different ways of doing it. In general speaking, modular cards are great as they expand your options, a bit similar to Flashback or Madness. Just basically gives you more things to do with your card, more different options you have. It's a very easy to understand mechanic. It allows situational effects to be more playable, as they can be, as you can choose which one you want. So because you have 2 cards in one, you can afford to make effects more situationals. So a good example of a modular card in Star Wars Unlimited are the legendary double aspect card that commands cunning, aggressions, and vigilance. But the problem is, like, those are that's pretty much the only thing we have as far as modular cards in the game, and they obviously don't work exactly the same as the split cards, because split cards you got in this case you always pay the same cost and you get different effects, while here you get different costs and different effects. So there's actually a higher level of choice and bigger consequence on the side you're choosing compared to those cards, which are great, but there's just not that many of them in the game. And basically split card would be another way to integrate additional modularity within the design of the card, which I think would be a really great positive. Moving on to our the card of the day for Card Market is Light Maker. You can pick up on Card Market for €10, a card I think will see significant amount of play in the games. You should definitely pick up. Moving on, we got the equipment mechanics. So bear with me, I have a bit of a rant to do about Star Wars Unlimited on this one. So the way that works here is equipments are just basically cards you play, and then you can basically play their equip cost to equip them to additional to units, to attach them to units, to give them additional bonus, like an upgrade. And the cool thing is, like, whenever the unit dies, the upgrade does not go in the discard pile. It actually stays on the battlefield and can be equipped to someone else as long as you're paying the equip cost. So cards, equipment have a cost, which is the card to put it in play, and then they have a cost to actually be equipped. And this equipment, for example, gives +2/+2. So why do I think those cards are great? The equivalent of upgrades in Magic are called auras. So they work exactly like in Star Wars Unlimited. You pay that cost on a unit, and you give them a stat bonus or a new ability, and then when a unit dies, the aura gets lost as well. And auras in Magic suck. They suck because they're either too weak, because they provide a 2-for-1 when your opponent actually deal with him, which is a bigger deal in Magic than it is in Star Wars Unlimited, but it is a deal nevertheless. And when they're strong, they can be too strong and just run away with the game. And basically, equipments are basically a fix to this. They're slower because you have to pay their cost and then equip them, so they're more expensive, they are slower. However, they are less all-in, because when they do get answered, whenever your opponent deals with the person who is actually equipped, you don't lose your aura. You actually get, you don't lose your card. The card actually stays on the battlefield and can be equipped to someone else, which I think is really great because it makes the card less all-in. It's all less answer or die kind of thing. It also thematically makes more sense. So let's say you put like Luke's lightsabers on Luke Skywalker. Luke Skywalker gets defeated. Well, his lightsaber falls on the ground. Someone can pick it up and use it, and this happens many times. In the funny thing is, like in Star Wars, it actually happens many times. You see many times you see players actually you see like Jedi being able to use the lightsaber. I think it's the one as the best example is probably Obi-Wan in the fight versus Darth Maul, where Obi-Wan gets Qui-Gon Jinn gets killed, and Obi-Wan picks up Qui-Gon Jinn's lightsaber to actually defeat Darth Maul. So and I think that's just to make more sense. one mistake that Wizard has made is like most, not all of them, this is a good example of, but most equipments in Magic are basically artifacts that are colorless by default. And which means that basically the problem that they had is like when equipments were too good, they were played everywhere because they were colorless, basically. They were neutral. And I think this is a mistake. I think that you should try to avoid making powerful neutral cards as much as possible, because then you're running otherwise you're running the risk of the card being played everywhere. And that's the reason why a lot of equipments in Magic get a bad rep. But I don't think it's because the mechanic is broken. I just think it's because they just made the mistake of making all the equipments colorless, and some of them are just insanely powerful. So how would that work for Star Wars Limited? So here's an example of the type of upgrades that I think are extremely obnoxious. Chewbacca is probably the best example, but there are many others. I think we talked about this in the Enigma podcast, and I think the entire team of Enigma has the same hatred towards pilots, but also the same hatred for upgrades in general. Upgrades are just not a good mechanic. They basically put players in situation of all or nothing that can result in massive blowout if the opponent has the answer to what you were doing, or just win the game by themselves whenever they don't answer it. And basically upgrades produce unfun play pattern. And as I said, equipment is pretty much just a fix of that. So it makes the upgrade just less all in, because once again they are more expensive to put on, but when they are if they actually get answered, at least the unit that equipping them is getting answered, at least you are getting your upgrades back, which I think is just much better from a design standpoint. I think every wearable piece of equipment, so there's certain upgrades that thematically cannot really be equipments, stuff like, for example, training academy, training, because this is not a physical thing you're getting, so those cards should probably gonna stay upgrades. But I think all the other weapons or clothing or anything like this that is wearable, I think all those should be designed as equipment moving forward, with a special cost to and I think that should be an evergreen ability, to be fair. It's just so much better than just the way upgrade works in Star Wars Unlimited at the moment. Finally, the last mechanic I'm going to talk about today is Ninjutsu. So Ninjutsu basically says that if you're attacking with a creature and this creature is not blocked, in Magic you're not attacking enemy creatures, you're attacking the enemy base all the time by default, and then the opponent chooses whether he's blocking the unit or not. But if the unit is not blocked, you can actually play the card as Ninjutsu in your hand, those cards, and then put him in play instead of the card that was not blocked, and then the card that is not blocked gets back into your hand. So you're basically adding a unit on the board for a cheaper price, which is usually the Ninjutsu cost, which is cheaper than the actual cost of the card. Not always the case, but most of the time that's the case. And you're also bouncing by the card that was attacking back into your hand. It's a very cool mechanic for multiple reasons. So here's an example of like a famous Ninjutsu card. Just like Morph, some units also get value when they actually deal damage to the opponent, because the unit is unblocked, so that means the unit will connect to the base when it happens. It basically provides a cool element of surprise, but that it's an element of surprise that can be played around. If your opponent is expecting Ninjutsu, he can block, but if he does, he can block them. So it adds an extra element and makes the decision making a bit more interesting. It also has a lot of cool self-bound synergies. Certain cards obviously get value when they get played, so you bounce them, you play them again, you get some value from that. It's fun and it's interactive. And how would that work in Magic? So obviously in Magic, in Star Wars Limited, of course, in Star Wars Limited, there's no concept of blocking. So how would that work? So the one way you could do it is you could make it so whenever you're attacking the base, you can only trigger the ninjutsu whenever you're attacking the base. But I think it would be a little bit, you could actually make it so it triggers at any time, to be fair. I would rename it Relieve. First of all, no Ninjutsu would not work for the Star Wars IP. And I would, the Relieve would work as an on-attack ability that could trigger if the unit is attacking base or a unit. Maybe this could be tested. And basically you could, we could even imagine like a version of Relieve where you could play it whenever you are defending instead of on attack ability. And it can even work to play events and not only units. There's a lot of different ways we could spin this in the game for this to work. But basically the main thing that it would introduce to Star Wars Limited is new action window to play cards. Instead of just playing cards during your turn, where I play a card, you play a card, this would allow you to actually play cards in moments where before you wouldn't be able to play cards. Where you can play cards on attack instead of playing it just during your action phase, which I think would be very, very interesting in my opinion. And that's it for this video. These were the 13 mechanics from Magic that I would love to see in Star Wars Unlimited. I've only put on this video mechanics from Magic that I've actually played with. I didn't want it to add any mechanic that I didn't play with, because I like to know basically what I'm suggesting, that how it feels like whenever you're playing the game, because sometimes reading an ability does not always give you a way to understand how the ability actually gets played. But I actually did play with all those mechanics for an extensive amount of time, playing Magic for more than 10 years. So I played with all those mechanics, and those are really, in my view, the best mechanic you could add. I'm sure there are other mechanics that have more recent that I haven't used that could be a great addition to the game as well. But anyway, let me know in the comments below if there's any mechanic coming from Magic, or even from another card game that would be compatible with Star Wars Unlimited that you would love to see being used in Star Wars Unlimited. And maybe let me know if there's anything you disagree with in what I've said. Thank you so much for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.